At least 66 people in the U.S. tested positive for bird flu during 2024. And on Tuesday, the first death of a person infected with the virus in Louisiana was reported, making 2025 the first year on record with a domestic human bird flu death. According to information from the CDC, infected birds spread avian flu through fluids like spit, snot, and feces. Other animals can get the virus and spread it via breathing in other organs and in bodily fluids like blood and milk. While health officials have stressed that the overall risk to humans remains low, concerns have been mounting of the potential for more widespread infections. I'm now joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group, to unpack this further. Dr. Raut, thank you for joining me today.
Happy New Year. Good to be here.
Now, what are the main symptoms that someone has contracted bird flu, and how are humans contracting it?
So the symptoms we typically see are fevers, cough, sore throat, runny nose, headaches, and fatigue. When we get more severe symptoms, you can get shortness of breath, severe respiratory illness, even sepsis and inflammation of the brain. So you can have a lot of severe symptoms with this as well. Now, humans catch bird flu through a variety of ways. The direct way is really when humans come in close contact with infected birds or their bodily fluids. And you will typically see this amongst poultry farm workers or backyard poultry keepers. There's also an indirect way. That's when you see humans coming in contact with surfaces that may be contaminated with the virus, like cages or feed or water or bedding. Now, there are some very small cases that you can get from inhalation, so it's in the air, and some very small cases where you can get from intermediate hosts, meaning humans catching the bird flu through contact with other animals who may have been infected, like pigs or other livestock. But most of the time, what we do see is the direct and indirect contact.
Now, what do we know right now about human to human transmission?
What we know is it's extremely rare, really. What we do see is there's a very small, limited cases, really a handful of document cases where we see human to human contact. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible, and that doesn't mean it may not evolve to make that more prevalent. But so far, what we can say is the risk is quite low for human to human contact, and really keeping all the preventive measures in place that we already have, like hand washing, is quite helpful to prevent this from spreading any further.
Now, there have been some rather scary figures put out about the fatality rate for known bird flu infecting humans. What do you make of that figure?
Yeah, so when we look at the fatality rate, numbers released even by the WHO, when we look at the case fatality, we see a rate of almost 52%. So that is a lot. That's almost half of people contracting it, passing away. What we do know is there's a lot of caveats to remember with this. So there's a lot of underreporting of mild cases. With many of the mild symptoms I mentioned, likely most people would keep that unreported anyway. There's also a severity of exposure. So the greater the severity and contact, the more likely of more severe illnesses. And then we should also keep in mind that there are variations by strain, and some strains of bird flu actually have much different fatality rates. Some are quite lower, in fact.
Now, health officials in Louisiana reported the first U.S. bird flu death, and Canada saw its first human case ever. Of course, these numbers are low, but how big of a worry is there that this will continue to spread?
Right, so it is very important to look at that first U.S. death. So that first human death from bird flu in the United States was reported in Louisiana, a 65-year-old individual with underlying health conditions, and there was a link to exposure of wild birds and backyard poultry as well. So what we are seeing in this case is what we expected based on the risk factors that we might see that this might be a more severe illness, which is very unfortunate, of course. I think overall we still see it as a low public health risk in general. I think the virus is not circulating amongst humans, but it is still doing the jump between birds and humans for the most part there. So I think the US and Canada are really actively monitoring the situation and ensuring that we're not seeing that change at this time.
Now, following COVID, anytime anyone hears of any sort of flu or illness, alarm bells start to go off. How important is it for people to practice proper hygiene, but also not panic about avian flu or just other illnesses?
Yeah, I think that's a great nuanced point there. So I think the first part is recognizing that proper hygiene is still very essential to preventing a lot of respiratory infections. So frequent hand washing is what we've talked about before. Regularly washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds will reduce the spread of germs. Respiratory hygiene, meaning covering your mouth and nose with a tissue or your elbow when you're sneezing, and then just keeping a bit of distance from people who are ill as well. Now, looking at avian flu or bird flu in general, I think we are seeing low transmission rates as well. We are seeing the primary spread from birds to humans. And so having that in mind, along with hygiene, is important because I think at this point, we are seeing a very low transmission issue.
Dr. Raut, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.